Computer. Okay, I recorded my screen. We're recording. Great, and I'm going to share my screen. Cool. Hello, everybody. So, Anne, you asked, how am I feeling today? I am feeling very pumped because this happens to be an area of interest for me when it comes to UI, laying things out. It's something that it's a technique that I kind of stumbled upon and partially kind of invented maybe like 5 or 6 years ago at my previous companies, and it served me very well. And it's always interesting introducing that idea to either designers or developers because they have some sense of it, but once they start understanding the pattern of how to use it, it changes the world. And my hope is hopefully I'm able to change your worlds today with this. So the thing that we're going to be talking about today are layout stacks. Now, the idea of the name stacks, as it applies to layout, vertical stacks or horizontal stacks, HStacks or VStacks, that vocabulary it's new to me. The concept is not new, but the verbiage of horizontal stack or vertical stack, HStack, VStack, is new to me, and it was something I believe that was introduced by Apple. In short, let's get rid of this. We're going to be talking about these guys, HStack and VStack. HStack is horizontal stack, VStack is vertical stack. And these two layout based components, we can think of them as components. You can literally build almost anything using these two ideas. And I'm going to give you some examples. So let's just look at this Dribble page for a second. And I'm going to enable my annotation tool. Great. Basically almost anything on the web or any kind of UI can be arranged using either a horizontal stack or a vertical stack. So if we take a look at this chunk here, can you see the annotation? By the way, like I'm drawing a square?
Yeah. Annotation is totally cool.
Cool. So we have a group of a couple of things, right? We have a title, we have some large text, I don't know what they call it, and we have a collection of buttons. So we can think of these as a couple of chunks, like that. So we have 3 chunks that are vertically stacked on top of each other, right? But in here, we have 3 things next to each other. These 3 things are horizontally stacked next to each other. So already we see the horizontal and the vertical stack in play. And if you look at this button even closer, can zoom? Oh no, zoom in doesn't work. I apologize. We have a button that has an icon that's horizontally stacked next to text. So that very quickly, horizontally and vertically stacking, we can apply this to just this one section here. Now that you understand the principle, if we take a look at this, we have a chunk here, we have a chunk here, and those are horizontally stacked in the same kind of arrangement. And then now here you have all these guys are horizontally stacked next to each other, and so on and so on. And you can start applying this in a bunch of different places. And I'm going to teach you with CSS how you can build this in less than 150 lines of code, and you can use this everywhere. That's what we're going to be doing today. I'm not even going to dive into React because that's too complicated. React is hard. I'm just going to be using CSS to do this. So what I have right here is a plain old HTML and CSS file. I'm going to fire this up there using this, I guess. Great. And you see a peace sign. Yay. So I'm going to do some live coding stuff. So before I do, is this kind of clear so far, the idea of a horizontal stack and a vertical stack? Cool. Mm-hmm. In CSS, we are able to achieve this using a property called display flex. Flexbox. This is a Flexbox model. Out of the box, Flexbox has many, many different things. You could, and people do, use a combination of Flexbox properties to just like code things kind of on the fly. Like, oh, I need this, so I'll just add some Flexbox something, and I'll make this a line here. Oh, I need to code this, and I'll just like randomly add some Flexbox somethings and so on. They add it in an ad hoc fashion. What we're going to do is because we've recognized these patterns of horizontally and vertically stacking things, we're going to be creating classes that you can then reuse everywhere you need them. That way you don't have to like ad hoc code additional things. And this kind of idea of identifying common patterns, creating something that's reusable, and then using that thing, it's the foundation. It's a foundational principle of how you think about libraries. So things like Bootstrap very much fall into this kind of thinking. And this is very much what powers the stuff I'm doing within G2. Anywho, let's jump into some code. So right now I just have a peace sign because that's all I have here. Peace signs are cool. I'm going to replace that with something else. Hot dog. Yeah, now we have hot dog. So we have a code, we have some code, and then live reloads there. Cool. So I'm going to write some CSS now. Just to start, we have to do some kind of resetting normalization stuff, and I'm just going to reset the body to have a margin 0 because in CSS or HTML by default, bodies have a margin of 8. I don't know why, they just do. So I'm just going to normalize that, and this is just reset stuff, has nothing to do with what we're going to do. But because I'm coding everything from scratch, I have to kind of add that there. So the first thing we're going to create is a basic flex component. Flex is going to have certain properties. Flex, the display of flex, align items of center, justify content of space between. You don't need to necessarily know what these are. Like I mentioned before, these are like random flex box-based properties that you would that people would ad hoc attach to things. But we're going to consolidate this into a single flex component. Great. So now that we have our flex class, let's add it. Display of div of flex. Now I'm going to add some inner divs with hot dogs. Yeah, 2 hot dogs inside of a display of flex. And with that, automatically, you see the hot dogs, they kind of separate and stack in that kind of way. We can't really see what's going on because layout-based styles are kind of invisible. And what I like to do is I like to add debugging kind of tools. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to add a debug class. Here I'm just going to add a debugging comment. Why can't I comment things? What the heck? Give me 1 second. Comment. There we go. And debug, it's a little fancy. What it does is everything that appears within debug will have an outline of 1 pixel solid, some shade of blue. RGB, that is some vague transparency. So now if I tag the body with debug, everything that appears within it will get a border. Mm-hmm. That's neat. Now it can see. Now it can actually see the thing that I'm working on. And when you want to, stop, you just remove the class, and you won't see that anymore. The border's a little strong, so I'm just going to bump it down a little bit. I'm going to show another cool thing.
Do you normally do this whenever you're working?
Yeah. So like inside of G2, there's actually a component called Component Inspector, which powers this whole thing. So if I turn that on, you can see every single G2 component that renders.
That is so cool.
Yeah, there's a tooltip that tells you the name of them, and it's very helpful when developing UI. Yeah, so it's a cool thing. We're learning some cool things here today. So we have that, but here's another thing that we can do that's even more helpful. I can see lines, but I don't necessarily know what I'm looking at, right? What is a flex, what is not, and so on. We can actually tell CSS to give us a label. So I'm gonna write that right now. Position, flex, relative. You don't necessarily need to know that part. Here is the interesting one. So we're gonna add a pseudo before, and I'm gonna tell it to render some content inside. And you can actually tell it to render an HTML attribute, and I'm gonna tell it to render this content. I want you to give me a label of whatever your class name is. So it's going to render there. If I do that just right now, we'll see the word flex appear in the browser. But right now it's disrupting everything. I don't want that. I'm going to change the color to match this one, RGB, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to make the font size a little bit tiny, line height. That doesn't really matter. I'm going to position it in a way where it's kind of above stuff. Top 0, left 0, margin top minus 10 pixels. I'm making up numbers. I don't know. But with that, we can see that the word flex now appears on the entire thing. So now I can see I'm looking at a flex, right? And it just comes from this. So if I added a bunch of things here, a bunch of hot dogs, we can see there's a bunch of flexes now. Cool. That's helpful. And I made a very interesting choice in building my default flex component. By default, things snap on the left next to each other in this fashion. That's the default behavior. I have intentionally made things snap on the edges. The reason why is because, this is my personal opinion, I think when you're developing UI, this is probably the most common pattern. Like when you take a look at applications like your iPhone or anything like that, you have a title and maybe you have like an icon to the right that says like edit, or maybe it's an X for closing. Or if you're in a Gmail, an application like email, this might be like new compose email or something like that. The most common pattern that I've identified is for things to snap on the edges. So that is a default behavior I'm building into my Flex component. So the interesting thing is, what if there are 3 things inside? Space between, what it does is that it evenly spaces things between each other. So now we have something like this, where you could have, if you can imagine, one of this could be like an icon, this could be like a title, right? And this could be a close button or whatever the case may be. But what if I want, okay, there's too many hot dogs. I got to change the hot dogs into something else. Mooncake. Oh, come on.
I love seeing frequently used. That's my favorite thing to look at.
Which one?
When it shows frequently used. Like,
yeah. French fries. Okay, so we have a mooncake, we have a hot dog, and we have French fries. What if I want to push my hot dog to my mooncake so that they're touching each other, and there's a lot of space in between these guys? So here, typically, what people do, and this is valid, and you can do this, is you would ad hoc randomly add things like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to margin right auto this, right? That works. So if you've worked with older CSS, people use float left and float right and all that, those float classes. Yeah, you tack that on and hope for the best. When something doesn't work, you would add hoc, jump in and write some styles to override whatever. But because we've identified this as a pattern, right? Like it's probably common that we want people to be able to push things to the left and right arbitrarily. So we're going to add a new class. This one's called spacer because we're going to add space between things. It's going to tap into the flex box property of flex 1. 1 is just, to simplify, it's just like take up the remaining space between something. That's all you're going to need to know. So what I can do is I can just add a spacer between these guys, and now it'll push things apart like that. And because I have my label, you can see that the spacer is pushing things apart. So now if I add more hot dogs, you can see that it's pushing them to the side, right? But what if I want to have chunks where I have 2 mooncakes, 4 hot dogs, and 1 French fry on the side? Well, I can group the mooncakes together like so by pushing a spacer like that. And now this here, what you're seeing, flex with the spacer, this is the foundation of the horizontal stack and the vertical stack. So now we have something that's interesting. We want like a little bit of space between all these guys, right? Because we don't necessarily, we want them grouped, but we want some space in between these various items. How do we do that? Well, let's see. The idea is like for all the items, let's just say we want them to be evenly spaced apart. Here's what you can actually do. So inside of Flex, all of the children, right? This is how you can target all the children. We're going to add some margin to it. We're going to add some margin to it. But we don't want it to, we want it to apply to everyone except for the last one. Because we say we're margin, but this one, we want to normalize it. We want to zero it out. So here's what you can do. This is a little funky, but you can do this. What this means is for every single item, the thing next to it will get a margin of something. So now by doing that, all of these guys have a margin of 4 next to them. Now they're spaced apart evenly. But what's common though is like you may not always need 4. Sometimes you may need 0. where you do need things to touch each other, sometimes you need them to be have a larger space. So we're going to use some CSS variables now. By default, let's just say it's a spacing of 4. Okay, variable of 4. There should be no difference. But let's start adding some utility classes that allow us to modify the space on the fly in a systematic way. For demonstration purposes, this is how I'm going to be adding utility classes so that it's kind of obvious when you look at the HTML. I'm going to name it SP0. SP0, it's just what it means is spacing of 0. And it's going to adjust the spacing property to have 0 pixels, right? Add a bunch. So now that is 1. I'm going to adjust these numbers. Don't you worry. 3, 4. Okay. So these can work like multipliers. Spacing 1 is 4. 2 times 4 is 8. 12, 16. So now I have some modifiers, right? So I have, I'm going to adjust some things in typical terrible HTML prototype fashion. I'm just going to inject some random BRs right there. So for our first flex thing, we have spacing of, that's normal, it has 4 pixels. But let's say I want to normalize that so that there's no spacing in between anything. I put spacing 0, now there's no spacing. I put spacing 4, now there's 16 pixels spacing in between everything. Cool. I have very fine-grained control over my UI with very, very little code in a reusable, understandable way. You can also do something fancy here. So let's say you have some sort of grid system in your code, which is probably preferable. Within the context of CSS variables, what you can do is you can attach variables onto, this is called :root. That's basically HTML, like the HTML tag. It's just at root. This is how you do things in CSS variable land. We're going to have a grid value of something. Let's say the grid value is 4. So now, instead of hard coding numbers like this, here's what you can do. We're going to use calc, which is a mathematical function inside of CSS, to do some math, very simple math, that multiplies against this grid value, right? var, this is referencing that grid value, which is 4 pixels. I'm going to multiply that by 0, spacing of that, multiply that by 1. So you kind of built that from here. You can kind of see. Is 2, dang it, sorry. 3, and so on, so on, so on. If I was writing this in JavaScript, it would kind of be a function. It would kind of, automatically calculate things for me. But I'm writing in just plain old CSS here. So now we have that same functionality, but we're able to, in a systematic way, let's say, oh, all of a sudden the grid value changes to 8. Everything will now respect that because we thought about that and we built that into our system. Cool. So now we have this, that we can now stack things in a horizontal fashion. How do we do things vertically now, right? Because let's say we want to jump back to here. We want to stack things vertically. How do we do that? We can't do that yet. Let's say I'm going to add some BRs. And I want to stack a mooncake on top of a hot dog on top of a French fry. Okay. Where's my example? I'm going to move this to the very first one so that we can see it in a way that doesn't disrupt everything. HTML. All right. How do we stack these vertically? Okay. Well, I need to add a new class now. I'm going to call this class VStack. Is the pace that I'm going at okay? Am I jumping around the code too fast or anything?
No, this is great for me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this one is just going to be called VStack. We're starting to use some of the verbiage now, VStack. And all this one needs to do is it needs to change the direction of how things are stacking. By default, flex, I believe the default flex direction is row. We want them to be stacked in a column. There's one called flex direction column. Flex direction column. By the way, I always get these ones mixed up and I hate it. That's why I change the names to like V or H or X or Y because my brain is able to parse that a little bit better. Otherwise, I always forget what they are and I run into that all the time. So now I'm going to add VStack onto here. Oh, look at that. They're all vertically stacked on top of each other. But there is a problem. And that problem is the code that we've written for spacing things apart. They're applying margins on the left and the right side. We have to adjust that because we want, when things are stacked in a vertical fashion, they need to have their margin on the top and bottom, right? Instead of the left and right. So what we're gonna do is we're going to unset or nullify the left and the right styles, and we're gonna apply them to the top. Cool. Now I have vertical stacking with that understands my spacing system. So now if I did, oh, that's not the right one. If I were to change my spacing of 0, what do you think will happen? They all will now touch each other, right? So now I can horizontally stack things, vertically stack things, add spacing arbitrarily in between if I need to. And I did this with less than 100 lines of code. And this thing is literally reusable everywhere that you can think of. Just by looking at this VS Code UI, right? We have a horizontal stack there. We have a horizontal stack within a horizontal stack, which is something you can do. You can nest these as much as you want. Vertical stack here, vertical stack here. This is how UI is composed. And you can do this with less than 100 lines of CSS. And so right now, if you were to think about the code projects that you've worked on, whether it's an application, website, or whatever, the amount of times you need to write arbitrary float left, margin normalization, all that kind of stuff. Like you can start, if you had components or classes like this, you can start refactoring those things, and your CSS, the size of your CSS will drop dramatically because this will take care of that for you, and you've done it in a way that is scalable, and it's fantastic. But here's the thing: we have to build the web in a way that is responsive, right? Because let's say we have our mooncakes or our hot dogs, but maybe on mobile we want them to be vertically stacked. How do
I was
we
just
do
about
that?
to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, how do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
So I wish I had Sass. That way I'm able to write some things that are a little bit less verbose, but it's fine. So to do responsive stuff, you would use media queries. I'm just going to use arbitrary values. These are common values, 40 EM, 62 to target tablet and desktop. What do those numbers compute to? I have absolutely no idea. They compute to some value. I don't know, but these are values that people normally use. Okay, so let's say we have, I'm going to change this one back to flex. But instead of flex, I'm going to call them, I'm going to create a brand new style. I'm going to call this HStack. Just so that we're now starting to identify things as either HStack or VStack. Mm-hmm. But before I do that, I'm going to variabilize something here. So now I have a column, and here we have a row. Row. So I'm going to create a brand new variable. I'm going to call this one direction. And by default, you'll be a row. This will use direction. And instead of setting the flex direction here, I'm just going to change the direction to be column. Oops. Similar here. This one is a row. This one is a column. If I jump back to my example, nothing has changed. Great, I didn't break anything. All right, let's say this thing by default is a horizontal stack. No, let's say by default, if we're doing mobile first, it should be vertically stacked on mobile. But as we bring it to, say, desktops, tablet size, we want these to float next to each other in a horizontal stacking fashion. So let's write a media query. This is tablet, not mobile. So what we can do is, let's say we want to, you can write media queries however it is you want, but this is how I like to do it. I like to use I like to use this kind of suffix, @md. Because now if you were to read the class, if I were to write the class in this way, this is how it would work. If you were to just read it, like, okay, it's a flex, it's a vertical stack, but we have a HStack @md at medium size devices. That I like adding breakpoints using that kind of verbiage. So that's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to go with it. So for classes that have HStack at MD, we are going to, we just kind of had to copy this, set that there, and we have to kind of copy this as well. This is where I wish I had Sass, but I don't. It's fine. We have margin left, and then the margin top will be unset. Okay, hopefully this works, fingers crossed. If it doesn't work, then I apologize. Oh, cool. So now, right, we have a flex, the flex primitive that we have it vertically stacked by default, but at the medium breakpoint, we change it to horizontally stacked. And that just works. And now we're just going to create another utility for, large sizes. Desktop is large sizes. And then we'll do the same for VStack as well, because maybe you want the inverse, right? Where something is horizontally stacked on mobile, but on desktop and tablets, say you want them vertically stacked. So now this one changes it to column. This top is that value. This one is left is unset. I'm just going to copy this, paste it inside of here. Cool. So now with, let's say 120 lines of code, you have something that is responsive ready, horizontally stacking, vertically stacking classes that you can literally build any UI you want. Yeah, any thoughts and questions?
It's like doing wonders for my organization brain. Like I love when things just like work and you can change one thing without having to go through. Like whenever you showed that you could just change that 4 pixels and then all of a sudden it would always respond and immediately do the math already, like that kind of stuff. Like you said, super scalable.
Yeah, and that's how we should be thinking about building UI. I think the more traditional approach is folks, maybe let's say you're working with a designer and you're a developer, something like that. And your designer gives you, hang on, I gotta turn off annotation. Your designer gives you some layout that looks like this, right? And it's like, oh, cool, here are my designs, I need you to build this. Developer's like, I got it. So what they would do in order is first, let's say pretend they already have this built. You just need to build this little content area in the middle. So they would build first the page, the step 1, right? And then they build things kind of in a top down. They look at things in top down. All right, now I need to build that. Now I need to build this. And now I need to build like that, right? In that kind of order. And then they go top down. If you're thinking about things from a systematic and component library level, you actually need to do the inverse. You build things from the smallest part first. Maybe you start here, right? That's a button, but in the button, you already see that things are stacking next to each other. So now, like, you have to go even lower. You got to build the layout system that supports stacking first, which is what we're doing. We did the flex with the VStack and we have the HStack. Cool. Now that you have that, the stacking mechanism, oh, great, I can reuse my stacking thing here. I can use VStack here. I can use HStack here, HStack here. And already with that built, you've built out a lot of the UI here. If you're flipping on your HStack VStack brain, that's like 80% of this built. Now you just need like some card UI, maybe some buttons or whatever, and you're done. And then the HStack VStack, those principal components you have, any page you need to build from here on forward, you can reuse them. And in the future, if you need to make adjustments to your system, like you had mentioned, oh, maybe spacing changes between 4 to 8 pixels, you adjust one value and everything will change.
Right.
That's how it should be. And that's how I've approached G2. Like in my documentation, there is a component called view. View is the lowest level component that literally renders everything. Everything is built on top of a view, including HStack and VStack. And that's kind of how I've approached G2. So yeah, what are some other things we need to do? Oh yes, I forgot about this. There is an interesting detail. I need some lorem ipsum. What's a good one? Pirate ipsum. No, wait. Is there a hot dog ipsum? There has to be.
This is my favorite, is to try and find a new one every single time.
Bacon ipsum. Yeah. Okay, the bacon's fine. Sorry, vegetarians. I am going to here is an interesting use case. For now, I'm just going to cut all this out so we can just see this one in isolation. Okay. I'm going to add some spacing though. By default, this one is the HStack. This is a very kind of common UI where you say you may have an avatar next to some text, right? This could be like inside of a comment kind of UI. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment. I'm going to make my hot dog a little bit bigger, to 28 pixels, sure. Okay, great. So now we have something that looks like this. I'm just going to clamp the width a little bit so it's easier to work with. This has nothing to do with HStack, VStack. I'm just adjusting some things so that we can see it for example purposes. Right. So this could be like a tweet or a comment or whatever the case may be. You notice how this hot dog is aligned in the middle of this stuff? So that is a decision I made very early with Flex in that I'm telling it to automatically align things to the middle. Because that's the most common kind of use case we have for building UI. Like you have some title, you have some button on the left, on the right-hand side, but their heights are different, but you kind of want them to be in the middle, right? That's the default kind of use case. That's what we built for. But in this case, we need to adjust the vertical kind of alignment within this. Mm-hmm. Similar to what we did with our with these modifiers, this SP0 or whatever, we can add another one. Let's just say in the odd case, you need to change the vertical direction of a horizontal stack. You can do this. Let's just say align items flex start. I may be wrong. And this, again, these flex properties I always forget. I have to Google and I feel embarrassed, but it's fine. Hopefully this is right. So now for this one use case, let's say I need them to be aligned to the top. Mm-hmm. And now we have that.
Excellent.
With that thing, you can apply, again, you can apply that anywhere. Edge cases, you need things to the top, bottom, doesn't really matter. You have that with this one single property.
Right.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of putting your property classes, so to speak, with that double hyphen to differentiate them. That's a really good idea.
Yeah. So I mean, this dives into the rabbit hole of CSS architecture. How are we supposed to name classes or whatever?
Right.
There's multiple approaches. I've been through them all. CSS object-oriented CSS, Max, BEM, ITCSS, everything you can think of. Mm-hmm. It all really does. Ultimately, it's all kind of annoying because everyone it gets fragmented anyway. So for me, I mean, there's various ways you can approach this. You can have things that are like, we have a default flex, and then you can have modifiers like this, top, right? This is very BEM style. Mm-hmm. You can have things that are kind of more object-oriented style, where you have this, where is a signifier of some sort of modifier, right? Like is top, is bottom, is left, is right, whatever the case may be. So yeah, take your pick. Whatever the case, whatever it is you want. But the idea, though, is to split modifiers as smaller, tiny things that complement your larger quote component, so to speak, in the world of CSS. And we see this a lot with any kind of modern CSS framework: Bootstrap, Tailwind. Those are the big two that I can think of. They are built on top of these principles, and it's really cool to kind of see how they've evolved over time to adapt these things. The CSS framework that I think really pioneered and pushed this thing forward was Tachyons. Tachyons embraces what you would call functional CSS, where there's lots and lots of tiny little properties. You would combine them together to get something much bigger. And that I feel like has a lot of influence over frameworks like Bootstrap and to some extent Material, and certainly Tailwind. And we're just adapting some of those ideas here, even though the verbiage might not be identical. We're building our own little custom component with modifiers in a very kind of frameworky kind of fashion that we can use within our projects. Yeah, so that is HStack and VStack, and you can use them everywhere. The only exception, though, I have to say, The only exception where this may not be applicable, and we're starting to see a lot of this in modern kind of fancy schmancy web design, is where people intentionally offset things in a grid. So you see things here where things like, I don't really align myself to anything because I'm a flower pot and I want to be more important or something. I don't know. Some design like this.
That does seem to be happening.
Yeah, we're starting to see this more and more, right? Where things kind of intentionally break themselves out of layouts.
Right.
You could use HStack and VStack to, set the primary kind of, hang on, I'm going to draw some boxes. You can use so here we can already identify this is an HStack, right? Oh, sorry, VStack. We have 3 things stacking on top of each other. Cool. And then now we have something here. This is a horizontal stack of 2 things. One is a content section, one is like imagery. But here we don't really have anything that aligns to anything. So in this particular case, the other complementary layout component kind of approach you can use that fills in the gap is CSS Grid. Because in CSS Grid, you can define the some sort of grid layout that looks like this, right? With whatever nonsense CSS Grid values you need. The thing that confuses me more than Flex within the world of CSS is grid. I always forget how you do grid things. That's like a whole nother topic. But for now, I'm just going to touch upon it very, very, very gently in that you can use CSS Grid to kind of build this kind of thing. But then you can use your HStack and your VStack to contain that grid. And then now you're able to have a very fancy layout that looks like this with not too much code that you can then reuse in other places. So you can probably, in theory, maybe, use that same grid component here to do whatever layout you need here. And again, you would use your HStack and your VStacks to align them in this fashion.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is...
Did you
so that's
around with the grid IO? It's like now sunsetted, but
that project
like
that's supposed to use
AI
machine learning to automatically generate your site for you, and then web designers are like, oh no, our jobs. Then 1 year later, everyone's like, oh no, don't worry about it.
Well, what's funny is I remember like I tested it out because I was like, oh, this is interesting. I want to see what's up. And well, one, I mean, you can create a bad website with any technology, no matter how great it is. So it was like really interesting to see some of the examples that came out. I followed a bunch on Twitter. But yeah, like this whole presentation is making me realize, like, I bet they were using a lot of this stuff and then trying to anticipate what inputs you're putting in and then adjusting based on that. Like, I think it'd be really interesting to see how they might have built out a system for it. And now I feel like I have better understanding of what they probably did. Because I have a feeling they overly relied on stuff like this to kind of...
you have to identify like those common patterns and then create some sort of system around it. And then you can add some AI ML marketing to be, oh yeah, we use machine learning to like blah, blah, blah. Give us a color and now here's your site. I'm not poking fun of them. What they're doing is very complicated. Cool. I can't even begin to imagine what goes into that. But the idea is like to identify those patterns and then reuse them in a way. And here's a really cool thing, I think, that touches upon just how fundamentally correct I think the CSS Flexbox model is for layout stuff. So all the stuff I touched upon today with Flex and just magically aligning things to the left and right, like that's a web thing. That is strictly a web kind of technology. That is a CSS web thing. But what's cool is that yoga layouts, I believe this is the one. Right. This is not hot yoga. This is the actual technology. Cool. So yoga is a framework built on top of how CSS Flex works in the browser, but they made it available for technologies like React Native for native mobile development. And now like any kind of technology can adapt yoga to achieve the same kind of like, oh, I want things to snap on the bottom, on the right, or whatever, with very little code because of this this library here. So I think it's really interesting, and it's also cements like, yeah, this is using these ideas, right? Using Flex to align things in this certain way. This is probably the more correct way to do things when you're building your stuff.
Yeah, and then you think about Gutenberg and like the grid layout that we're starting to show people, like a lot of that kind of stuff. This is going to be really interesting long term to encourage like good behaviors between blocks
Yeah.
and
So
interactions.
that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know. So
Patterns should be helpful here too, but
where you would use Flex in this, like the HStack in the context of Gutenberg, would be the column block where you're able to align things in like the 3-column or whatever the case may be. I feel like they're using Flex underneath the hood. I can probably look at the source code and confirm. But yeah, like if we are able to nail that, and then people are starting to compose things with lots and lots of columns, then like the code that eventually outputs that has already been pre-optimized, hopefully, by the considerations that we put into like the ideas of grid and flex and so on. The other challenge is like trying to adopt what I demonstrated today, the idea of flex and HStack and VStack, into the code that build into the actual Gutenberg code. Because right now it's not. It, like I mentioned very early in the call, anytime you need some arbitrary layout thing, you just ad hoc write some inline flexing, because these ideas of common principle kind of layout components didn't exist yet. It's the flex component was something I added into Gutenberg. It's there, and I've tried to use it whenever I could, but it's still in its infancy. HStack and VStack were things that were built on top of Flex that were more refined within the G2 library, and within G2 that was the thing that was a eureka light bulb moment where I was like, oh, I figured out how to do it in React now. kind of. So hopefully I can bring those principles into Gutenberg, and as you've seen, with the demonstration today, how you can literally build everything. That will help us a lot in cutting down the code, making sure things are scalable and so on. Yeah. So that's my little presentation today on layout stuff.
I learned a ton.
I'm so glad you guys popped in today. Any questions?
I did have one question.
Yeah.
You used the spacer, which was, that's exactly where I would start writing CSS.
Oh, yeah.
But I was wondering, like, when I learned CSS and HTML, it's, like semantic HTML, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And sticking a div in there for spacing just like tweaks against like everything I was taught.
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. So I know what you're saying. I have the exact same feels. So I'm gonna, in my example, I'm gonna try something. Okay, hot dogs. Great. I have some hot dogs. So let's say for some reason we need this chunk of content to be like here. Whoops. Can you see when I'm like drawing boxes? Okay, cool. And we need this to have a gap, right? So what you can actually do is you can actually render this in the spacer. And then you inject a random empty spacer here, and it should achieve that effect because it'll space things apart evenly, like so. So now we touch into the semantics, like empty div that does nothing. This is wrong. I get it. And the interesting thing about HTML semantics is when it comes to applications, it's really tricky. Because when you're trying to display content for an article, like you have your H1s, you have your list, your bullets, and all that stuff, that's fine. But when you're building application UI, jumping into an example like, I don't know, something like this, I can imagine there's lots of divs for layout reasons that just position things, and they don't have any semantic meaning.
Right.
So I think what you can do if you want to try to be more semantically correct is if you have an empty spacer that does nothing, you can actually add something like this.
Okay.
That then hides it from screen readers. Now screen readers kind of ignore this part. Right. Or you can do something like role presentation. Like it's purely for presentation. I don't have any semantic value. Sure. You can do that, and I feel like that would satisfy that kind of like it's not semantic kind of gross feeling. If that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes sense.
Great. Cool.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I just started a brand new project today, actually, and I'm
Oh, nice.
setting some site-wide padding values, and I was like, wait a minute. Now, I wonder if we could. I read the so you did that star plus star selector, which I know List Apart had an article about that.
Yeah.
And that just kind of exploded my mind. And now thinking, okay, yeah, basically all the time we're either laying stuff out horizontally or vertically, so we can set, sensible defaults, right?
Yeah,
And
that's what they are.
90% of our layout with a couple lines, rather than hard coding everything component by component.
Yeah. So there is a caveat, the asterisk to these asterisks plus asterisks. And that is like, this is a naive assumption that everything you have inside is purely for layout and it's not going to have its own margins. And then I'm going to like override it for you and it's going to be fine.
Right.
In the case where, let's just say you have, let's say you have a button that has its own styles, right? It has its own margins for reasons, because reasons are the best kind of reasons. So this button, I'm going to make this a little better. It's going to have an icon next to it. It's going to be, it's going to be a pizza. Okay. So now I have a pizza button here, and it has its own margins. When it's used in this fashion, right, this one is going to override these margins, and now things are going to be sad. What you can do is, if you need to protect it for reasons, you can just wrap it in something else. And now the margin styles are respected here because this one's kind of shielding it. This one is absorbing the margin styles that Flex or HStack is applying, and allowing this one to preserve its own kind of styles. So what some things you can do to kind of make that clearer within the context of your HTML and your CSS is you can add classes that are like called flex item, or like a flex item. And I think because Flexbox isn't perfect, it's kind of strange. You may need to add some kind of normalization things like min width is 0. This is this tiny detail. You may run into this. I'm just letting you know ahead of time. So in the case where this one might have margin for reasons, you can wrap it. And now looking at the code, you can identify, oh yeah, this is a child of a flex because that's what it belongs to. And now I'm just sticking something inside, and the asterisk plus asterisk rule is still fine here. Nothing is exploding, and it's fine. So you can do that. Yeah, that's my only thing. Like, this is incredibly powerful, but Spider-Man quote, great power, responsibility, whatever. You have to make sure you know exactly what it is you're targeting. Oh man, so a little story. The moment I saw this and this kind of technique, I forgot what they call it. It's the something owl from the list apart article. I'm like, oh man, yeah, some of the bottomized owl or something. My brain also exploded. Like, oh man, everything is a you can apply margins to everything, and I just one line of code, I fixed like 60% of my site. If you were to do this as a global on your site, I mean, oh yeah, everything stacks, so therefore is margin top of, I don't know, 4M or whatever the case may be, 1M. Like, this is the example they had in their article, something like that. And these are the examples they have online. I naively implemented this in a previous company I worked on in the CSS framework. And basically, half of the framework was designed to inverse this. It's like, this is probably what I want, but for some cases I actually don't want this. And now you're building like lots of random reset code to handle this kind of global application, like randomly apply and margin top to everything. So that is a danger for this kind of thing. So yeah, you use this very responsibly. It's very powerful, but yeah, just know what it is you're targeting when you do that.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think this really helps. Only apply this to the immediate children. That's the other thing. Because if you can technically do that, that'll work. But then, that would cascade down, and everything will have spacing, and then everything will be sad. So yeah, only target it to immediate children. And I think if it's helpful, I can share. I can probably create a GitHub repo and I can share this code so then people can like poke at it and like copy it if they want to. But yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so then here you have your Flex components. You have this very handy debug tool that you can now see everything. Yeah, you can copy that if you want. Yeah, I can't wait to see how this helps and how this impacts whatever it is you're doing. And the really cool thing is I actually learned about HStack and VStack, the verbiage of them, when I started learning Swift UI from Apple as a for fun kind of thing. And I was like, oh man, my brain kind of exploded 2.0 when I realized like this is like they really refined the idea of horizontal and vertical stacking. And then in one of the, I think it was one of these Zoom calls where I actually built that inside of the G2 framework. And after that day, like HStack and VStack has made its way throughout the entire library because everything kind of uses that. And it's really, really cool and powerful to see how like very simple, well-defined ideas like that can have such tremendous impact on a project. So yeah, I think that's what I have for today. Any other questions or thoughts?
Just thank you. That's really
Yay!
cool.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm gonna stop the recording once you guys pop off. I'll share this, and I'll also share this, the code. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
Great.
Awesome.
Catch you later.
Bye.
Bye.